let's talk about collaborative note-taking with HedgeDoc. So HedgeDoc is a platform for collaborative note-taking, and specifically designed for collaborative note-taking with Markdown. So when I talk about collaborative note-taking, I mean multiple people writing into the same document at the same time, and everybody being able to see that display synchronized as everyone's contributing all at once. So really very similar to the Google Doc that we're writing into today in the collaborative notes from this session. And yeah, the key thing here, I suppose, is partly that HedgeDoc is an open source platform, and it's partly that it recognizes Markdown syntax. And I'm going to talk a bit more about what that means and why it might or might not be helpful to your community in a moment. There's a note at the bottom of this slide to mention that HedgeDoc, I guess, and associated projects, there's a very confusing naming history and sort of community management history in all of this. If you're interested in open source community management, I do recommend spending some time reading through the various threads that caused all of this. It's very interesting and you might learn something. I'm not sure exactly what the takeaways are, but well, I found it interesting anyway. HedgeDoc itself used to be called CodeMD, which used to be the community edition open source version of the HackMD platform that I saw some folks mention already in the collaborative notes document for this session. CodeMD as a community project, as an open source community project, kind of got forked away from the one that's managed by the folks at HackMD. And then it got renamed because it was still very confusing, and now it's called HedgeDoc anyway. What you can actually do with it is broadly the same regardless. And I'm going to talk about, I guess, all three of these things as we go through. And in the Q&A at the end, I'll try to make it less confusing if I need to when we get there. Anyway, how many of you have written any Markdown before? Type yes into the chat, give a thumbs up, whatever, so that I've got a bit of an idea of how much experience you've all got with Markdown. All right, so we've got some folks with experience in Markdown, but I'm going to proceed on the assumption that at least some folks do not have experience with Markdown and give you a bit more information. So Markdown is a relatively lightweight markup language for formatting the content of documents. So what that means is that when we're marking up text, we're applying some kind of system for identifying which parts of the content that we're writing should be formatted in which different ways. If you've ever had the misery, I suppose, of writing lots of HTML from scratch, then you'll know that HTML is a markup language as well. And Markdown, I say, is relatively lightweight because it's certainly a lot easier to mark up content than it is to do so with HTML, although you might sacrifice some power, I suppose, and flexibility by choosing it. So some examples that I've given here: if you wanted to make these two words bold text appear as bold text, then you could add 2 asterisks either side of those 2 words, and that would then in the document that gets created from this Markdown source, it would appear as bold text. Similarly, you could write a link to the Carpentries homepage by putting the text of that link in a set of square brackets, and then immediately afterwards in a set of curved parentheses or standard brackets if you're British. In there you would put the URL that the link should point to, and then that will become a linked version of that text that you wrote in the square brackets, pointing to the website that you were pointing to in the curved parentheses. And if you wanted to write a second level heading, whatever that's going to look like in your created website or document or whatever, then you would put 2 of these Octothorpe hashtag symbols at the beginning of the line, and then a space, and then whatever you wanted the text of the heading to be. The advantage of using a markup language like this is, well, one, that it saves time. It really improves the consistency of formatting. You know, if you decide that you want to change how all of your headings look, for example, then you can do that once and it will be applied to all of the things that you've set as a particular level of heading and so on. And it allows people to focus on the content that they're writing without spending time worrying about how that's going to be styled as they go along. It's really widely supported. GitHub supports it sort of natively. So in issues and comments and things like that, you can write with markdown syntax, and GitHub knows what to do with that. GitHub also has various tooling that knows what to do with markdown files that you store in a GitHub repository and so on as well. It's also supported by Google Docs. If you open a new Google Doc and go into the preferences for that document, there's a little checkbox you can tick to tell it to recognize markdown, and then you can write with some markdown at least in that Google Doc. And another advantage that it can give you is that you can publish content to HTML to serve as a web page online very quickly from a markdown source file. You can do the same thing or a similar kind of thing to export a PDF version of the markdown that you've written that will then display all of that markdown formatted in the ways that you've specified. Or you can convert it to various other kinds of text file as well. All right. So it's demo time. I'm going to switch over to a tab and I'm going to copy and paste this into the chat. So this is HedgeDoc's demo server, a demo instance, to give you an idea of what you can do with a HedgeDoc setup if you have one for your own community. The first and most important thing that I want to share with you is that this is the way that this is set up is in no way secure. The traffic between your computer and the server that it's running on is not particularly encrypted or anything, and there's a very good chance that whatever you type will be intercepted by somebody. So please do not start writing your passwords or anything in here. But if we play around with it and do something harmless, then hopefully we're not going to cause any problems. If you go to this site, you can click this new guest note button. And what you're presented with then is this sort of standard split screen interface for HedgeDoc or for HackMD or for CodeMD, if you're familiar with any of these. And on the left, this black half of the screen, for me, that's where we would type our markdown. And then on the right here, we're going to see the formatted version of the text that we're writing, and this should automatically update as we go along. Follow along with me if you'd like to. So let's give a title to this. We're going to call this kittens. I'll paste the link to my specific document in case you want to contribute here as well. And so I put this kittens heading as a top level heading by putting a single hash symbol here. If I wanted to make this a second level heading, I'd put 2 hash symbols. The third level, I'd put 3. And hopefully you can see that this heading over here on the right is kind of getting smaller with every additional level that I add. And if I go back to the first level heading, then it will appear. Somebody's very good with emoji, so thanks very much for putting that in. Then an example of how you can add an image. So with an exclamation mark at the beginning, and now we get a pop-up giving us a hint about what else we could write here. So in the square brackets, we write the alternative text description for the image, and then in a second set of square brackets, a reference, or in standard parentheses, we can write the URL to the image. So let's do that. A kitten. And then in parentheses, we'll put HTTPS : replace kitten.com/300/300. And there we go. We get a nice picture of the kitten. It's also another thing that it's very useful for is writing code, like code blocks, and seeing some syntax highlighting for that. So I could write some Python between 3 backticks, as I am doing here, and put import image IO as IIO, closing 3 backticks, and we get a code block like this. But if I tell HedgeDoc that this is Python by putting Python after the opening set of backticks, then on the left-hand side I get some syntax highlighting, and on the right-hand side in the rendered version I get some syntax highlighting as well, and I could add some more Python code to show a more expanded example. Copy and paste that in, and yeah, we can also add bullet point lists, for example, and numbered lists too. And if you're curious about more Markdown syntax, more features of the platform and so on, then I recommend that you click the little help button here, which gives you a kind of cheat sheet version. But then under documents here, there's a link to this features page, which I'll copy and paste into the group chat as well, so that you can check that out if you'd like to. But unfortunately, I don't have time to stay and play around with more Markdown and more of the features now. So how do we use it? The Carpentries hosts its own instance of something very similar, a kind of historic version of what has become HedgeDoc, which is at codemd.carpentries.org. And the interface and the features and so on are very similar. We're hosting that on I think on an AWS cloud server. Manisha is probably better placed to answer questions about exactly how it's hosted than I am. But anyway, people can go to codemd.carpentries.org and they can create documents there. They can also sign in with an account, and so they've got access to a history of the documents they've created and so on as well. And so I've lost my presenter notes. There we go. And so typically our CodeMD system is used for meeting notes for any groups and subcommunities who are comfortable with Markdown. Christina, the benefits of hosting your own instance are that you keep all of your notes data on your own servers, so there's like a data privacy aspect to it, and you can manage your user accounts and so on for your community. There, it also gives you access to some of the features that if you were to try to use HackMD, you'd need to pay to have like a paid account to be able to use those features instead. The community, some members of the community, again, those who are comfortable working with Markdown, draft blog posts on the system as well, because our website builds blog post web pages from Markdown source files, so it's easier for people to draft the blog post directly in Markdown in those cases, and it's also used for note taking during some workshops. But again, I'm going to stress this one more time. It's really only useful where the people involved, I suppose, are already familiar enough with Markdown. So like the learners in a workshop, for example, can be expected to understand what they're doing with Markdown and not be intimidated by it or confused by it. Or I suppose in circumstances where they're not familiar with Markdown, but getting them familiar with Markdown is one of the actual main objectives of the workshop that you're teaching. And I'll add as well that it's not the only platform that we use for collaborative note-taking at all. In fact, it's probably the least commonly used. We use Google Docs a lot within the core team, and across the wider community, we use another platform called Etherpad, which is kind of similar for plain text note taking, but without the markdown support. Which brings me to the last important slide for me to cover, because I'm at time, which is a comparison of some of the different features, I suppose, of those different platforms that I just mentioned. So Google Docs and our CodeMD system, or HedgeDoc, those both support Markdown. Google Docs is an option, whereas with CodeMD or HedgeDoc, it's kind of built in. And so again, there's that caveat that I recommend you only use it if you can expect your community members to be familiar with Markdown. Etherpad doesn't support Markdown syntax. You can get a version history out of all three of them, version history of the document, that is. Google Docs is the only one that provides that that really nice functionality for people to suggest specific changes within the document. And CodeMD also doesn't provide a sort of accompanying chat thread to go with the changes that are being made in the document as well. One of the nice things that it does provide is that you can embed images, as you saw in my demonstration. I had said that Etherpad and CodeMD provide line numbers, which I find really helpful when I'm running a meeting or a workshop to point people towards a specific line in the shared notes document. But actually, Alex Nenadic told me while I was preparing this talk that Google Docs added line numbers this summer. So that's one that can be ticked in all three columns as well. Yeah, so automatic source code highlighting is a nice feature provided by CodeMD and HedgeDoc. And of course, it's open source, which I think is something to be cheered as well. So I had one more slide, but I'm going to drop those recommendations for use into the notes document, I think, so that I don't take up any more of Manisha's time. Thank you for listening. I will hand over to you now, Manisha. I'm looking forward to answering people's questions at the end.